Hey there, Record for the short hiatus. Here we are with this episode of the Fireside Chats, which is Period 6 Review, Part 2. We're going to pick it up with Key Concept 6.2, Roman numeral 2. Larger numbers of migrants move to the West in search of land and economic opportunity, frequently provoking competition and violent conflict. So we're talking about the West, and where there's West, you can imagine there are Native Americans. So westward expansion really picks up after the Civil War when the U.S. Army has no longer anything to do, so it's able to be turned on the natives to promote economic growth and capitalism in America. The most important events that occur between that army and the Native Americans are the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, where General George Custer's cavalry is decimated by Sioux warriors in what is the biggest Native American victory to that date. Unfortunately, it's short-lived, and the whites are able to gain a foothold shortly after that. But it is a symbolic victory for the Native Americans because it shows that they are not uncivilized brutes that are just able to be conquered at the drop of a hat. With the persistent issues that the Native Americans are suffering, they look for explanation and they look for salvation, and they do so through a spiritual revival called the Ghost Dance, which happens around 1889, 1890, which freaks a lot of the Americans out. So Americans then decide to do up the Native Americans once and for all, and that's where we have the Massacre of Wounded Knee in 1890, which in essence closes the frontier, stops Native American resistance for roughly 100 years, and sort of opens up the West to whatever economic development Americans have in mind. Now, in addition to the warring and the fighting with the Native Americans, Western settlement also decimates the Native tribes and their way of life. They do so first off by killing the buffalo. The white settlers kill the buffalo in large numbers because the buffalo get in the way, but they also see it as a way to decimate the Native Americans. On a more macro level, the government passes the Dawes Act, which is an assimilation bill, seeks to stop the reservation system as it had been known, and stop native autonomy on land, and sort of divide reservations up into parcels, and in order to make Native Americans small sort of subsistence farmers, much like the whites were. And then finally, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which was a government organization that had been around for a while, actually was tasked with assimilating Native Americans, killing the Indian, saving the man. All right, so westward expansion, once the Indians are out of the way, and sort of while the Indians are getting out of the way, the government facilitates westward expansion by the passage of a number of acts. Two of the most important, the first being the Homestead Act, which is passed in 1862, which, as you recall, gives 160 acres to people who are willing to settle in the West. They have to stay there for 5 years. They have to pay the paper fee, but other than that, 160 acres, all theirs. Now, a bigger and more important event is the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, which is a railroad that's begun in both Sacramento and Omaha, meets in the middle at Promontory Point, Utah, is finished in 1869. It's a big deal because it gets people out to the West. Not only does it ruin the landscape and it totally drives Native Americans off their land, but it is what brings people out west in large numbers. So its completion really it has a profound impact on the West. Now, people who are going out to the West, they travel out there for many different reasons, which we'll talk about in a second, but it's important to note that it's a diverse population out in the West. There's Mexicans left over from populations that had lived there prior to the Mexican-American War, which, as you recall, was fought in the 1840s over California and New Mexico, not Texas, and fittingly not with Spain. Okay, there's also white Americans, there's Chinese immigrants who had been there to labor on the Transcontinental Railroad, and there's also Native Americans, which of course, well, they were there first. Okay, and then finally, as more and more Americans settle in the West, eventually the West is going to be deemed closed. And in 1890, there's a federal census taken that shows that for all intents and purposes, the West has been settled. And historian Frederick Jackson Turner, 3 years later in 1893, historicizes this, puts it into writing, and says that in his frontier thesis that the closing of the frontier is going to create a crisis for America, and that's where American imperialism is going to come in. But like I said earlier in part 1, we're going to pick that up with period 7. Okay, as the West is developed, there are three major Western industries that we see sprout up in the West. The first is farming. Farming starts small scale and independent, usually homesteaders, but since homesteaders can't make it, they have a lot of difficulties. It's eventually taken over by corporations, and land holdings are consolidated into big, huge agribusiness, massive corporate farms that we see out there today. Another important industry out west is mining. Mining started on the surface and picking gold and silver out of rivers and sort of what you could get at with a pickaxe, but once all that was exhausted, you needed bigger equipment to get deeper into the mountains. So the mining industry has eventually taken over by corporations. Mining had a profound impact on the landscape in that not only did it, chip away at the mountains and whatnot, but you saw boom towns sprout up around places where precious metals were found, and then once the precious metals were exhausted, you saw those boom towns turn into ghost towns. And then finally, the last major industry is cattle ranching, which started, of course, with cowboys, but since the cowboy was short-lived, driving the cows to the railhead proved to be economically, financially ineffective, so eventually corporate ranchers are going to take over, and they're going to create large-scale cattle ranches that are going to utilize the recently invented barbed wire to keep the cattle in. They're going to situate these near railheads for easy transport, and they'll transport these cattle to Chicago where they will be butchered. All right, that brings us to key concept 6.3. The Gilded Age produced new cultural and intellectual movements, public reform efforts, and political debates over economic and social policies. I rewrote key concept 6.3 as capitalism, which alters everything, forced many cultural and social changes. You go ahead and rewrite key concept 6.3, hopefully not using the same words in the College Board's version. Pause me, go ahead and rewrite it now. All right, so key concept 6.3, Roman numeral 1, new cultural and intellectual movements, both buttressed and challenged the social order of the Gilded Age. So cultural and cultural things and ideas both made the Gilded Age stronger, but challenged it at the same time. So let's talk about these ideas. First one, social Darwinism, which we alluded to earlier in part 1, basically is the application of Darwin's survival of the fittest, but applied to people and social groups. So it basically argues that workers who are low class because they are not fit. And the idea is that if you take a low class unfit person and you wed them or you breed them with a low class unfit person, they will produce a low class unfit person, which is bad. So the more that we can do to sort of stop that from happening, the better off society will be. So the story goes. Now, that doesn't really take into account why they are actually low class and unfit, but that's another story. Another paternalistic idea was the gospel of wealth put forth by Andrew Carnegie, who was obviously one of the robber barons of the time. But remember, those robber barons are also sometimes referred to as captains of industry because they did partake in a lot of philanthropic endeavors because they had so much money. Andrew Carnegie wrote in his Gospel of Wealth that these wealthy people should take their money and they should give it back to society. They should try and uplift the poor people with it. They shouldn't live ostentatious lifestyles. And some of the wealthy industrialists listened to this, but Carnegie was definitely one of the more forthcoming with his money. Now, did this take the place of, actual social justice? No. All right. And then finally, the social gospel movement, which we also alluded to in part 1, was religious groups advocating for using religion as a way to uplift populations. Now, while that sounds like a great idea, not really all that helpful because those religious social organizations don't have the power, don't have the scope to really initiate change. So their impact was sort of limited. Okay, and finally, key concept 6.3, Roman numeral 2, dramatic social changes in the period inspired political debates over citizenship, corruption, and the proper relationship between business and government. Okay, so the politics of the Gilded Age goes like this. The presidents were really, really weak. Can you name any of them? Didn't think so. That just goes to show you that the presidents really weren't doing much. Political machines and big businesses carried the day. They were the ones who had all the power. They were the ones that influenced politics more so than did the president, more so than did Congress. That's why we've looked, there's a very famous political cartoon called The Bosses of the Senate, which shows trusts being in control of the Senate, which is why the populists argued for direct election of senators, because if senators are elected through a more bureaucratic process like they had been, it allows for more corruption. Now, in the national political climate, there were two parties. The Democrats were usually the ones who were controlled by the political machines, and then the Republican Party was that controlled by big business. Democrats usually got the poor immigrants to vote for them. Big businesses usually, well, bought a lot of votes. They both bought votes. Who are we kidding? This is America. Everybody buys votes. Women during this time period begin to make an inroads into politics and into society. They get notoriety from philanthropic work like Jane Addams and Hull House. But also in Western states, they're actually extended the right to vote because they're helping in the household and they're proving their worth. Sad that they had to do that. Sad that it wasn't just assumed that they were that they carried worth. But you know, this it is what it is. Okay, and then finally, race relations remained, if not became worse, during the Gilded Age, and that's embodied most explicitly by the passage of Plessy versus Ferguson, which is the famous separate but equal Supreme Court case. It just goes to show you how conservative, with regard to racial justice, the Supreme Court and Congress were during the time period. And then finally, sharecropping in the South. It's all about the bottom line. So the best way to make money if you were a cotton plantation owner was to hire cheap labor, since you couldn't have slaves anymore, sad day. So you had to get cheap labor somehow. Why not make them sharecroppers? All right, so that is going to bring us to the end of period 6. And as you can see, it's all about the money. So this is reminding you, go make the world a better place. It's not all about the money, as it seems. Peace.